All right, so let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to this inaugural kickoff panel to the Undergraduate Research Conference here at IUSB. This is the Psychology of Perception of Abuse, Aesthetics, and Dogs. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off a little bit out of order from the program, but we're going to start off with David Pugh and complex choices and why you won't like them.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Again, I'm David, and this is Complex Choices and Why You Won't Like Them, in which we study complexity in art within the context of video games. My interest in this topic came from spending several semesters working as a game designer and writer on student-run game development projects. So to start, we're going to look at a quick example of some paintings to get an idea about complexity in artwork. So this first one is, excuse me if I pronounce this incorrectly, A Sunday on La Grande Jatte, I believe is how you would say that. This is by George Seurat, and this will be our example of a relatively simplistic piece. You can, no matter who it is that looks at this painting, you'll get a pretty good idea of what it is that's happening, mainly due to its use of easily recognizable shapes, such as the human figure, and then the colors and the way that they're shaded depicts the picture pretty clearly that this is an active park in maybe spring or summer. So anyone off the street that looks at this picture will get a pretty good idea of what's happening relatively easily. Now, this next one is titled Black Lines, and this is by Kandinsky, and this will be our example of a complex painting. Despite the fact that it uses easily recognizable colors and simplistic geometric shapes, this may take a little bit more thought and reflection to decide what exactly it is that's happening here in this painting. So, as this is our example of a complex painting, the theory that I use to base the current study on suggests that the perception of complexity in a work is dependent upon the individual's declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is any background information that a person brings with them into viewing a particular piece of art. So they tested this by grouping their participants into two groups. There was an experts group. This was made up of art historians, and then there was a novice group, which was made up of general undergraduate students. The participants of both groups were asked to look at a number of paintings and then rate their perceived complexity across the board to see how complex each painting was. And then consistently, the experts group rated the paintings as being lower complexity than the novice group, indicating that because they have this pre-existing knowledge, it's easier for them to place these paintings within some sort of context. The question for today, is this true of video games also? While paintings present complexity purely through visuals, video games are capable of presenting their narrative in an interactive manner, and thus our definition of a complex game will be the amount of narrative variation. So the more possible narrative conclusions that a game has, the more complex the game is. So here is an example of that. This is a flowchart of a single level in the game Detroit. This game was released in 2018. So as you can see on the left here, this is where all players that begin playing the game will start the level at a singular point here, and then each point along the flowchart represents a different variation in the narrative dependent on the player's choice, until finally we reach one of the 6 possibilities there at the end on the right. So all of us that play this will possibly find a different story as we move through and make our choices depending on what's presented. This will be our example of a complex game, while this next flowchart is an example of a simple game in which the story moves in an entirely linear fashion from beginning to end. Anyone that picks the game up will experience the same story no matter the choices that they make. So how did we go about testing this? First, the hypothesis is that similarly to the past study, more experienced players will enjoy complex games more than less experienced players. To find out, we examined, again, an experts group and a novice group. In this case, the experts were professional reviewers from around the internet, and the novices were user-submitted reviews from anyone who had purchased the game and then taken to the internet to voice their opinions. Our list of games was made up of 24 of the highest scoring games released in 2018. And again, just a reminder, the definition of complexity for this is the amount of possible narrative conclusions that a game presents. So before we move into the graphs, keep in mind that these scores are out of 100, and the higher the score is, the higher the level of enjoyment is. So this is sort of the skeleton for our graph here. Along the x-axis there at the bottom we have complexity, and then on the y-axis here on the left we have the scores of enjoyment. So this is for the expert group. You can see that the scores move in a relatively straight line. Despite a range of complexity, they all fall between about an 80 to a 97 range. So even if the game is very simple or very complex, the experts found themselves enjoying the game. However, this was not the case for the novices. As you can see, there was a negative correlation between complexity and enjoyment as complexity increased. So what does this tell us? First, it tells us that the hypothesis was supported. The experts did, in fact, enjoy complex games more than novices. Likely, this is because the less experienced players were maybe finding it more difficult to make decisions about these choices that they were presented, or that they were overwhelmed by the amount of choices that were placed in front of them. So, finally, to return to our main point of communication, to the game designers or writers out there, this would indicate that we maybe should not be too strongly enticed by the possibility of narrative variation in our stories. But to the context of art in general, this is a reminder that complexity is medium dependent, as we've seen with the paintings presenting it visually and the video games presenting it in the amount of narrative variation present. So, in conclusion, art holds great potential for communication, but what does it matter if the observer is unable to make sense of the message that we have presented? Do you have any questions?
All right, we got time for questions.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
So you measured your dependent variable was mostly how much they enjoyed it, how much they liked it, how pleasant they found it.
Correct.
Can you apply this to maybe university learning a little bit in terms of simple, complex, expert, not novice? I don't care so much if people are enjoying it, but would you have added, thinking about adding a second variable of, are they, oh, okay, I take that back. I do.
Either way is fine.
Either way is fine. But what about sticking with it and learning more complex stuff? How would you add a second variable, maybe?
Okay. That is.
Like, how do novices become experts? How do they go from novices to experts?
Okay. Well, for this one, I was more focusing on overall, like, experience playing games. But there are a lot of games that will actually teach the player how to play as they move through. So you could maybe break the games down into a level-by-level study in which you just look at one game and see they introduce this topic very early on, and they give you an example of how to use it, and then you're put into a situation in which you maybe have a couple of choices on how you solve the problem that's presented, and then testing how players do that, and then maybe seeing which one is the easiest, why, or which decision most players went with. Possibly get that.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much, David. Okay.